Well, hello friends. Welcome to another edition of Review That Book in 20 Minutes or Less. I'm Stacey Fitzgerald. I'm a certified nutritionist, and today the book we will be reviewing is Learned Optimism by Martin Seligman. Martin Seligman is considered pretty much the father of positive psychology, and if you're into psychology, you may have read Viktor Frankl. Why do I mention that? Well, I'll save most of my comments till the end. But if you are a Viktor Frankl fan, his most famous book is Man's Search for Meaning, you might see some things that I saw in reading this book. And so I'll bring up a couple little caveats at the end, but let's get started on Learned Optimism by Martin Seligman. First of all, the preface and the introduction. Time for the glasses. He really just talks about what is positive psychology, and basically it's finding what's right and making it better, as opposed to finding what's wrong and trying to fix it. This might sound a little bit like StrengthsFinders. Have any of you ever read that book? That'd be a good one to review. That's definitely positive psychology. All right, he talks about 3 forms of happiness: pleasant, engaged, and meaningful. There's that word meaningful if you're a Viktor Frankl fan. He talks about the problem that he sees is that we're living in a very I-centered world, and we have this sort of unwarrantedly high self-esteem, which seems to be leading to problems of depression and violence. And he asked this question of, well, shouldn't self-esteem really correlate to well-doing? This was his conclusion, is that we have lost what he calls our spiritual furniture. And he refers to this as our faith in God, community, nation, and a large extended family. So he says optimism is not the same as self-esteem. And he goes on to say we're going to compare optimism versus pessimism, which really is our outlook that matters the most. He says pessimism is our problem, and it's the precursor to depression and anxiety. Here's a couple quotes. This problem will not be ended by Prozac. And he also says it is a grave moral there is grave moral dangers to making an entire generation dependent on drugs for their mood and productivity. So his solution: teach optimism skills at home and school. We will come back, there's that second caveat I have at the end, to the biological side a little bit more, but what he's talking about here is the learned part, thus the learned optimism. That is what we will find out is cognitive therapies. Okay, I'm jumping ahead. All right, chapter 1, the book is in 3 parts. So part 1 is the quest, and chapter 1 is called The 2 Ways of Looking at Life. Here is where he really describes pessimists and optimists. Pessimists believe bad events will last a long time, will undermine everything, and are their fault. Whereas optimists believe that defeat is temporary. It's confined to this one thing, not my fault. So troubles are more of a challenge to overcome. You can change, learning a new set of cognitive tools. This is one of his keys here. So he talks about helplessness versus personal control. Helplessness being that nothing you choose to do affects the outcome. So your personal control is your ability to change things by what you do. That's why they're polar opposites. He talks about our lifestyle, or life cycle. We start in helplessness as babies. We move through a range of personal control and end our lives basically in another state of helplessness. And that helplessness, this attitude that leads to inaction, a helplessness attitude leads to inaction, okay? And pessimistic habits turn setbacks into disasters. They basically amplify them. But he proposes that you can choose the way you think. So the big implication here is with depression. If depression is linked to pessimism, then maybe depression could possibly be changed by our conscious thinking. He also talks about achievement, that talent and desire are important, but when you compare them to optimism and pessimism, the optimistic mind frame weighs out in success. So learned optimism is a new science of personal control. It's not, he says, a rediscovery of positive thinking, and it is using the power of non-negative thinking. So the central skill of optimism is you change the destructive things you say to yourself when you experience setbacks. All right, I better move right along, huh? Chapter 2 is learning to be helpless. Here he shares his testimony of how he got into this study, and he talks about an experiment with dogs that many might find upsetting, as he did, and how he used this experiment with dogs to discover that you really could teach someone or a dog to become helpless, to learn that there was nothing they could do in one situation to stop something, and it did cross over into other situations where instead of trying at all, they would just give up. So if he basically purports, if we learn that our actions are futile, we'll no longer take initiative, become passive. If we conclude there's nothing we do that matters, then why try? His theory is that voluntary behavior is motivated by our expectation of result, and that helplessness, meaning nothing I do matters, is at the root of that. So we can learn control to never become helpless. And this is where this theory of cognition comes in, with the thought that we could cure learned helplessness. And it could even be a prevention if children could learn early enough that responding matters. And that's really the teaching to prevent, is that responding to something matters. So here's a big question. Some people and dogs give up and some don't. Why? And he talks about resilience in the face of defeat is not an inborn trait, but it can be required. And this is really where his life work got its feet to the ground, so to speak. All right, chapter 3, explaining misfortune. This is where you actually will take a test and see what your explanatory style is. And what that means, an explanatory style, is how people explain to themselves the bad things that happen to them. I call this the why behind the what in my nutritional counseling. So he's talking about our habit of thought. And there's 3 basic dimensions here: permanence, pervasiveness, and personalization. Is this impermanence? Is this thing that happened, this bad thing, permanent or temporary? Pervasive, is it universal or specific? And personal, is it internal or external? Here's my 3rd caveat on the end, and he mentions it very briefly, is this comparison of responsibility versus personalization. And that's a really key point, because it could be an arguing point, as he mentions, to the validity of personalization. Salt you to the end. All right, chapter 4, ultimate pessimism, which he calls depression. That pessimistic explanatory style is at the core of depressed thinking. That we're in a current epidemic, and he goes on to give a lot of details about that, what causes depression, and the problems. Here may be a 4th caveat at the end. I guess I did mention this, that the majority of it could be psychological and not biological. So I can definitely see some people going, well, wait a minute, what's the biological aspect? I don't think he's saying that it's never biological, and I know he's not, because it talks about that in this chapter, but that much of depression might be more psychological than biological. Learned helplessness is actually a lab model of depression, which gave him the basis to study this. And it's caused by experiences that nothing we did mattered. So learned helplessness can be cured by teaching to think differently, showing that actions can actually work. He proved this with dogs when he demonstrated to the dogs that they could do something to change the situation they were in, that they learned that they could. So it really can be overcome, and that was so key, which also leads to the thought that it could be prevented. Again, he mentioned that earlier, with early learning that actions make a difference. So the epidemic of depression, could it really be an epidemic of learned helplessness, the belief that your actions are futile? Wonderful question. Chapter 5, how you think, how you feel. He's really compares a lot, goes into some history and standouts of scientists in a Freudian mind frame, behaviorists, and kind of the development of cognitive therapy, disorders of conscious thought. And he brings up this point of rumination and how ruminating on bad events really affects optimistic or pessimistic thinking. He discusses how cognitive therapy is sort of the behaviorist optimistic belief in change plus the ability of self-change. So where behaviorists think we can change someone or an animal's behavior by sort of conditioned response, Seligman adds to that there's a desire for self-change. So yes, we're going to change behavior, but it's going to come from self, not just from external events or people. He mentions 5 tactics for cognitive therapy. 1 is to recognize our automatic thoughts. 2, dispute those automatic thoughts with contrary evidence. 3, make different explanations, reattributions. 4, Distract yourself from rumination. And 5, recognize and question these overarching assumptions of pessimistic thinking. And why cognitive therapy works? Because it gives you permanent skills and tools to change your explanatory style, the way you think about bad things, from pessimistic to optimistic for self-change. All right, that's the end of part 1. Part 2, he calls the realms of life. When I read the book, I actually skipped part 2 and went to part 3. Part 3 is about how to learn optimism. And he tells people, some of you might just be jumping to go, and I did. I read that part, then I came back and read part 2, but we'll go in order here. Here he just gives some examples. So the realms of life, chapter 6 is success at work. And he gives a casework study about working with MetLife Insurance. The question was, can you predict he'll never give up? This is a job that is a lot of cold calling, and these employees receive a lot of rejection from their cold calling potential sales customers. So they really wanted to get to the bottom of hiring people that could handle this job. So optimism predicted best who survived, not necessarily talent or all these other things that MetLife was using at the time to screen new employees. And the question of, is there a proper role for pessimism, was very interesting here. And he gives a couple areas where pessimism is actually beneficial because it has a realistic mind frame, whereas an optimist might always think the best is out there. The pessimist will have more of a realistic and accurate view of things, which there is a proper place for. And he calls that flexible optimism, where they balance and check each other. And the final chapter in this book, he comes back to that concept of flexible optimism. Chapter 7 is Children and Parents, the Origins of Optimism. Very, very interesting here that he points out 3 basic origins of this way explanatory style. The mother's the most important in the family dynamic, and that most children will pick up the same explanatory style that their mother has. Then adult criticism. Children believe what they hear when they fail. So when they've been criticized a lot by an adult, teacher, a parent, that also can affect their explanatory style, and also major crises, losses, and traumas. Chapter 8 is school. Here he goes into talking about is talent, and he was doing a case study with some Ivy League schools, and it wasn't just talent or test scores, or did optimism actually predict better who would succeed in school? He also found that bad life events, particularly divorced parents, or at the root of it, fighting parents, was a huge deterrent to young people becoming optimistic. So he recommends be close with your child. I love that. And that aptitude plus talent without optimism or with pessimism is really meaningless, and you'll drop below your potential. Okay. Chapter 9, sports. This was super interesting. The question was, can a team have an explanatory style? And the answer was yes. Again, case studies that are very interesting to read through. Shows that optimism leads to success and not vice versa. Sometimes people think, oh, they're successful, that's why they're optimistic. But he proved through these studies that optimism is actually at the basis of success. And that the explanatory style predicts how people will respond to defeat. So here were the recommendations for sports teams. Recruit optimists, use pessimists only after success. They don't do well after a failure. And then retrain the pessimists to a more optimistic explanatory style. Chapter 10, health. Of course, this one was one of my favorite, being a nutritionist, and a lot of things about Frankl popped up here for me. Because he talked about hopelessness is life-destroying. So the question, could hopelessness cause death, or could optimism save a life? If you've read Viktor Frankl, you know that he was in a concentration camp and noticed those that would give up and die literally within a day, and those that lived through unlivable circumstances. All right, here are the concept of mastery versus helplessness. And he talks about how the mind controls health through the brain, through neurotransmitters and hormones. Goes into detail, which I loved, but I will spare you. I want to tell you all about it, but we got to finish the book here. So causes, mechanisms, and therapy behind health and illness, and why, in psychoneuroimmunology I studied in school as well, is how the brain basically affects your health and wellness. So his connection here was, well, if cognitive therapy can change the brain, Then can't cognitive therapy change your health? Really cool. In prevention and treatment, there's a lot of really great, what's the word I'm looking for? My brain needs some help. I want to say consequences, but applications. Chapter 11, Politics, Religion, and Culture, New Psychohistory. This was a new one to me, but very interesting. And he goes into the study of the 1988 presidential and Senate elections, and then studies the past and the future of certain elections to show that if you look at the explanatory style of the candidates, that those that had optimism and were action-oriented were by far the winners. And they proved that they could then predict by looking at the past who was going to win future elections, and they did it with very high success rate. So then the question came up too, can a culture or a nation or government have an explanatory style? There was a story that went along with that. The question is yes, or the answer is yes. And then religion, studying Judaism and Russian Orthodox, that across the board, a particular religion can have a more optimistic or pessimistic explanatory style. All right, part 3 is changing from pessimism to optimism. This is the tools, and chapter 12 is called The Optimistic Life. Here's the nuts and bolts of change, the actual tools. And he talks about when and when not to use optimism. And I love this. He said, look at the cost of failure. If optimism is going to push you to try something, even if you do fail, if the cost of failure is really high, you might want to go with pessimism. That would be more of that kind of red flag that says, hey, maybe we shouldn't jump off this particular ship. He gives the ABCDEs that he goes into of how to change your explanatory style. So adversity, A, is just what happens. B is your belief or your thoughts, your self-talk, your self-conversation. And C is the consequence. So he first starts with ABC and says the way we think will make whatever that adversity was that just is bring about a certain consequence. And so the way to change that is with the D and the E. The disputation is really the number one tool. And then you look and see what kind of energization. Did it change your energy? Did it bring you to a more optimistic place? The tools of disputing are distraction, they're distancing, and then literally disputing. How do you do it? Evidence, is it true? If so, change. Alternatives, implications, if it's true, don't catastrophize it. Say, yeah, what is the actual implication of that? And the usefulness. The key is that emotions and actions come from your belief. Almost lost my battery there. From your belief about the adversity. So if you can change your belief, you can change the emotion that comes out of it. Your feelings don't come from nowhere. And that leads us right to chapter 13, helping your child escape pessimism. They can unlearn, but to teach it early is better. And remember how important mothers are here. So if you're a mama, watch how you explain bad things in front of your children. The key here is that they know that how your child feels doesn't come out of nowhere, but that your thoughts about the adversity are what bring about the feeling. And then he goes into how to teach the ABCs and the D and the E to children. Chapter 14 is the optimistic organization. That, remember, an organization can have their own explanatory style. So he talks a lot of details about specifics here, but brings it down to 3 important things. Select and hire optimists whenever possible, but place them properly in the kinds of roles where they're needed, and know when pessimists are better suited for a role, and then teach optimism. Again, goes into the specifics of the ABCDEs. And then here is the final chapter, flexible optimism. And to me, this was, if you want to start anywhere, or if you said, I'm only going to read one chapter, after listening to this video, you could read chapter 15 and get so much from the whole book. So he calls flexible optimism is optimism with eyes open. And in this generation where we have this waxing of self is getting bigger and bigger, and this sort of waning of the commons, the seeing ourselves as a community has brought about a loss of purpose. Frankl, sorry. All right, so big self, the benefit of this elevated self is you can change self. The problem is too much choice, which brings a lot of pressure. If you think about what he called our spiritual furniture and the commons, if we've lost this God, family, country, identity, purpose, then everything is on you as an individual, and that's a heck of a lot of pressure to bear. So he talks about two possible cures. Change this balance of the exalted I and bring about more of a commons, a sense of commons, or you could exploit the strength of this maximum self, he calls it, by teaching optimism. If an elevated sense of self brings us to a place where we do a lot of self-help, we could teach ourselves more optimism. So optimism is not meaning, and I thought this was really important. It's a tool toward choice of meaning. That's that key word there, especially as we are about to end this and talk about Frankl. We need a context for meaning and hope and purpose. So the final points here, learned optimism plus a commitment to the commons can heal depression and meaninglessness. Optimism has its limits, culture, reality, and responsibility. Pessimism has its place, reality. Here's his solution. Learn it and then choose when and where and how to use it. It meaning optimism. Learn the skills of optimism, choose when and where and how to use it. We use this, we're going to see less depression, higher achievement, and better health according to all his studies. And when we don't use optimism is when we really need reality and clarity and absolute responsibility to own up to something that's happened. So know the benefits and costs, choose flexible optimism. When I first read that last sentence, I thought, well, why don't he name the book Flexible Optimism? But really, it is about this whole concept of learning optimism. So important. All right, so here are my personal issues, not so much, but questions as I went through the book. First, personal versus responsible, and he brought it up and tied it up neatly at the end for me. When he first talked about pessimism being that we take everything personally, I thought, well, shouldn't we own up to the responsibility when it's been our fault? And he mentions this concept of responsibility versus over personalization. So that's the key, is the extreme. If we're blaming ourselves for everything, that's not good. But we do need to take responsibility for what is our issue. And then we can also, the optimists tend to have almost a blaming sort of outlook. It's everyone else's fault or something else's fault but mine. So while that empowers an optimist, it may not be the greatest of moral characters. And then this epidemic, could it be partly biological? As a nutritionist, I know the effects of sugar, additives, toxins in our society. Have you ever had a time when you don't even know why, but you just feel ick? Sometimes it is the way you've been thinking. And that's what I loved about this book. I can go back and think, what was I thinking before I felt that feeling? Sometimes you might be toxic. Heavy metals, which is a huge soapbox of mine, can cause brain fog and depression and an overall feeling of just malaise, just ick. So I don't want us to throw out that biological component, and I know Seligman wasn't. His focus, though, is on this psychological side of depression. And then Viktor Frankl. Okay, so I could not help but all through this book, when he would be talking, I would think, that's Frankl, that's Frankl. Why am I not seeing one mention or connection back to Viktor Frankl? And I thought, this has to be purposeful. Somebody who is so learned in psychology certainly has read Viktor Frankl. And I could not quite wrap my head around this. And so before I did this review, and I know I'm over 20 minutes, but this is my added on. I pretty much did the book in 20 minutes. I thought, I've got to find out if I'm just crazy or if anyone else has seen this and is scratching their head and sort of pacing the floor saying, why aren't we talking about Viktor Frankl in this positive psychology? Well, it turns out I'm not the only one. And it took me a little bit of searching to find something. And then I found exactly what I was feeling, which was a podcast on a show called Shrink Wrapped. It was pretty cool, with psychologist Marshall H. Lewis, who is a logotherapist. And logotherapy is the name put on the type of therapy that came out of Viktor Frankl's work. And really it means meaning therapy. So his supposition was that he was a contemporary of Freud. And Freud said that we pretty much are just subject to these beastly powers within, that we will just seek pleasure and sexual drive and all the things that the flesh wants. And Viktor Frankl said no. And he proved it by his observations in the concentration camps, where he spent, I believe, 2 or more years of his life and lost many of his family, that people will overcome and do things that are very hard on themselves and give up their lives even, or have the ability to live through excruciating circumstances when they have meaning and purpose behind what they do. So what I wondered was maybe Martin Seligman was almost purposely divorcing himself from logotherapy and from Viktor Frankl, because in a sense, Viktor Frankl's work comes across as a little bit more of philosophy than measured science, laboratory science. And that is exactly what Marshall H. Lewis came to the same conclusion, was that while there are so many similarities in conclusions, that positive psychology really wanted itself to be based in laboratory science and not to be dismissed as a philosophy or a religion. And so there was, I think, my personal opinion as well as Marshall Lewis's, and I'd love to ask Mr. Seligman if that is also what his thoughts were, is that he purposely put a little distance between himself and Viktor Frankl for that reason, that he wanted all of his work to be empirical, measured, data-based, and not to fall into that philosophy category. So that's really what I found. I'll put a link below this video to that podcast because I thought it was super interesting, and you might as well. And then one last thing on a totally personal level is this concept of community that Seligman brought up in the book, that I just made this note to self, that federal, big communism coming down from a very high government power is not the same as true community. And when Martin Seligman is talking about the possibility of bringing a better balance and bringing back a commune, this awareness of community, I want to encourage people, as we have done, to really develop local communities. I think that's where we see the interaction, because there's a give and a take. And when we have federal communism, we have control still from an imbalance of power. But when we have local communities working together, we have a garden, our neighbor has a garden, and we'll swap out. I've got more cucumbers and he's got more squash, things like that. And personally, my husband and I walk in Torah. We keep the seventh-day Sabbath, and we follow the biblical feasts. And in chapter 15, Martin Seligman gives a list of things that are sort of this perfect optimistic community. And as I went, just like through the book, I went through and going Frankl, Frankl, Frankl. I went through going Torah, Torah, Torah. So his list is exactly what, like a Torah community of believers, how they function together in the way they give, serve, care for the poor, admonish and encourage one another, and teach their children. So overall, I absolutely loved this book. It has been a huge help in my personal life. I now catch myself, what is my internal conversation? And I dispute that conversation. We all know how to dispute when someone comes against us. And that's something that Martin Seligman says. He says, use those tools and the tools that you can gain from this book and dispute your own negative thoughts and see if you can learn to be more optimistic. Great book. Thanks for watching.